Good morning. For me, anyway. Welcome to the lecture and happy learning.
Chapter 9 is talking about unmarried lives, which includes being single and cohabitation. Looking at the chart, the table on 9.1 in the book, page 324, we can see how being single has grown significantly. Looking at the numbers, in 1960, it's grown from, for men, 30% of men to 46% of men. So that shows you how much that has grown over the past few decades. 107 million Americans over 18, 63% of which have never married. 47% of all households now are headed by unmarried, 28% one-person households. And this is throughout the globe, though it does vary by ethnicity. As far as never married adults, from 20% in 1980 to 28% 2014, though many still are considered to be yet to be married. Marriage is still a goal for a lot of people. As far as being single, the divorce rate, as we talked about before, really peaked during the 1980s, but it's stabilized since then, around 40 to 45% of first marriages. There's also become a more acceptance of non-marital sex, but we are seeing an uneven ratio of men to women, where there are more men than women until you get into the senior years, and then it flip-flops. Since the 1960s, when more women started to enter the workforce, divorce started to become more socially accepted, things like that. There were higher status for women, the women's right movement during that time. A lot of progress was made, still not on par, but still women have been able to become less dependent on a husband. So those another few things that are influencing singlehood. And the social costs of being single have reduced. The coming back here that the fear of divorce may actually deter some marriage. So if people understand that, there's a chance that we could get divorced, that could deter marriage in the first place. Cost of being single, there is less stigma to being single. I can even see that in my lifetime when I was younger, approaching my 30s, would see the stigma attached with not being married, less pressure to be married, and reduced need to be married. As far as the never marrieds go, there's a few variations. We got the voluntary versus the involuntary never married, whereas some people may choose to stay that way, or some people just may not be able to make it work or find someone. And then, of course, there's the temporary versus the permanent variation, where people are considering that, yes, for now, would like not to be married, or then some people say, no, I will never get married. There are a few myths, stereotypes still attached to being single or singleism, the immaturity, the lack of commitment. As I said, when I was younger, even the corporate heads tend to put a little bit more faith in someone who was married because they felt like that maybe they had a little bit more commitment in general, more mature in general, and therefore a little bit less promotability if you were single. You might be unattached, willing to just take off. Of course, that's almost flip-flopped in my lifetime. So that's an interesting transition. Marriage still has a potential to be overhyped, as that it's going to be the end-all, be-all, the source of happiness and fulfillment. That maybe we are realizing a little bit more that it's perhaps not all that, contributing to never marrieds. And interestingly enough, never married singles fare better overall, long-term, in mental and physical health than widowed, separated, or divorced. So we still see the gold standard of being married long term, healthy, successful relationships are still the best as far as long term mental and physical health, but never married singles are second to that. Talking about cohabitation, living together, there are 20 times more heterosexuals cohabitating as couples than there were 40 years ago, as shown in the figure 9.1. Since 2000, about 68% of women who married had cohabitated prior to that. So what are we seeing? More liberal sexual climate as we progress over the past couple of decades. The meanings of living together have changed. The ideal of delaying marriage, whether it's trying to get a good job first or more college first, but we are delaying marriage. Women, as I've said, less dependent on a man, and the childhood experience of being in a family that was unstable or that the parents had conflict, that could also be an influence to more cohabitation. So times have changed quite a bit just in the last few decades. As far as the types of cohabitation, there are people that are doing it to try out what marriage is going to be like, trial marriage, or a precursor to marriage. We mentioned how engagement has lost considerable of its symbolic importance, so people living together in lieu of a formal engagement, you might say, or substitute for marriage instead of marriage. If you're living together and committed to each other, how indistinguishable is that actually from marriage? We'll see there are some measurable differences. Co-residential dating is still fairly rare. People that are just dating but living together for the convenience or the economics of it, that could lead to other issues, but also a form of cohabitating. And then just as an alternative to being married or being single. Childbearing is still typically delayed till marriage. We are also seeing more consensual unions, which have their roots in the Latin American cultures. Also looking at ideas of marriage contracts where people are legally married for a certain period of time. Not really sure how if that's going to latch on. We'll talk about in a minute that cohabitation is not necessarily a predictor of whether or not your future marriage, if you get married, is going to be stable or unstable. It's called what used to be called the cohabitation effect does no longer apply because of more and more people that are cohabitating. Cohabitation, living together, you do have fewer rights than being married. There was quite a few legal benefits to being married. And there is, not surprisingly, an increase in post-marital cohabitating because if people get divorced and feel like that maybe they could have done it better the first time, or they may want to check it out better the second time around, so they live together and test out the relationship. Interestingly enough, this could be somewhat counterintuitive that the odds of the second divorce are twice as high as the first divorce. We'll talk about some reasons why that might be, perhaps in the discussion question. Comparing living together, cohabitation, with marriage, because of the legal benefits and the formality of it and the effort that goes through getting married, tend to see stronger commitment with marriage than with cohabitation. That could be fairly more casual. Cohabitators, more autonomous, easier to split when there's difficulties. That's probably one of the reasons why we are living together in the first place, perhaps. Sex typically is more frequent in cohabitation, and that just may be a matter of the shorter time involved, or the earlier that's usually involved in a relationship. And a very strong norm, even amongst cohabitation, overwhelming majority, almost universal, expect sexual monogamy. The differences in money management are obvious with cohabitation, because when you're legally married, regardless of what you do with your money, it is community property and it is considered 50-50. So you could pool it, or we may be less intertwined financially when we're living together, keep our accounts separate. That could perhaps be an option, or a sharing account, that could be an option. There are findings of increased stability with relative equality in earnings, and that kind of goes with what we originally talked about, where people are generally attracted to other people in their same, generally similar socioeconomic strata, and that would also help the stability if they had relatively equal earnings, where one of them is not as dependent on the other. No guarantee, obviously, but these are just statistical trends that tend to play out. And with cohabitation, no legal obligations with breakup. As I mentioned before, and the court shows, the courts have really no recourse in dividing up your pots and pans if you're not legally married. Some more on the comparisons. Children generally tend to stabilize marriages. Now, be careful, that might not be a reason for getting married if you've got, or perhaps staying married. But once children are introduced into a marriage, it stabilizes for various reasons that are having to do with focusing on the children. And there are increased odds of marriage for cohabitating couples when the children are introduced into it. Looking at the general trends across the country, cohabitating couples are more likely to be poor, thus relatively less stable, more risks to children. There's health disadvantages to children if they are not married. Children lack the legal protections and institutional social supports that marriage is designed to. The children benefit from that as well. Marrieds still show health benefits and longer lives, particularly if it is a successful, fulfilling, stable, happy relationship. And as I mentioned before, cohabitants tend to fare better than separated, divorced, widowed, or never marrieds because of the stresses involved with these other things. Cohabitants fare better compared to those just below the successful marrieds. But on average, cohabitants, so here's what you've got to keep in mind with statistics. We've got one trend looking this way, but also because of other factors, we've got to look at this. Cohabitants, because cohabitants are generally of lower income, have lower relationship quality because of the less commitment involved, perhaps the less long-term vision, whatever may be causing them to live together. 57% report being very satisfied, and this increases with the intention to marry, as I've mentioned. Cohabitation, as a result of the less legal obligations and commitments and goals, whatever, cohabitation more likely to be temporary, and therefore there's less social support for cohabitants. We're still saying this, and this could change over time. The cohabitation effect, I put a question mark there because early on when people started to live together, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, there was not as big of a pool that researchers could look at, and the research had suggested that couples who had cohabitated before marriage had a higher likelihood of divorce. However, cohabitation while being engaged did lower that risk. And since the 1990s, as we see more people cohabitating with various more outcomes, this effect has no longer held up. It's very difficult. Some studies may see a slight association, others may have the other way, but unable to significantly show an effect of cohabitation on the success of the future marriage. Older cohabitants report higher levels of quality, and this may more have things to do with when you're older, you might be more mature, a little bit more wiser, have higher income. So those things all kind of play in with older cohabitants. Length of time of the relationship before moving in matters, much like it would in any other successful relationship. According to polls, 50%, almost half of cohabitants said that it just sort of happened, that we just ended up living together. There are increasingly more legal forms of cohabitation as opposed to the former, what we used to call common law marriage, that is kind of fading away, where the couple is lived together long enough to where they can somewhat present themselves as being married. And there were some famous cases where a relatively successful actor had been living with someone, and when they broke up, the partner went to court claiming common law marriage. So she had felt like she had been entitled to something because of the fact that they were presenting themselves as married. Most states, including New Jersey, no longer recognize common law marriage. Domestic partnerships is another increasing option, more limited than civil unions, which is more like a contract. New Jersey has that, which provides some rights and protections. But domestic partnerships is interesting in that corporations are providing that in their benefits. 2/3 of Fortune 500 companies actually offer domestic partnerships for same-sex couples, and that showing to be increasing a little bit for heterosexual couples as well. So those are some options for cohabitants. Speaking of gay and lesbian cohabitation, same-sex couple households have increased 20% since 2010, and that's because of the increased social acceptance and the approval of same-sex marriage. And about 60% of same-sex couples that are living together are now married. 27% of the female couples are raising a child under 18. Probably have heard some things on the news about either adopting a child or having a sperm donor, somebody that they choose to impregnate the partner and then have the baby and raise the child. Unmarried same-sex couples' median income, however, is 27% lower than married same-sex couples. So again, we're looking at the same trend, that people who are living together, not married, generally have lower incomes. Therefore, that then associates with increased other potential problems. More prevalence of interracial couples and same-sex marriage, and that makes some logical sense because it's a little bit more difficult, perhaps less of a pool out there to pick and choose from for same-sex relationships. So therefore, they have to branch out more into looking at interracial options. As far as living together, there's no significant difference in the issues that homosexual couples have, except for the gender roles as to who may be doing what particular role, and the role model aspect of, particularly for their children. So those are the major differences that you would see in homosexual couples. Otherwise, issues are relatively the same. And what we'll kind of increasingly get to towards the end of the class and end on is that it's all about the family atmosphere, not so much about who the family is. And one of the first definitions that we talked about, that households are now not just being married or adopted in, but of choice. So we're seeing different ranges of choice. LGBT relationships are broadening the concept of family. We are constructing more families, even though it is still based on heterosexual model. And regardless of the structure of the family, there are similar strong desires to have children. That's in our nature to reproduce and multiply in order to procreate the species. So there are different options for having families and relationships that we're increasingly seeing more of. So stay tuned for discussion question.